Unpacking Mormonism is a subsidiary of Daisy Girl Communications, LLC. All content herein is intended for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice or counsel of your personal care provider. You know, it wasn't until I was in my master's program for behavioral health, for mental health counseling with Walden University, that I began to recognize just how often my voice was being silenced within the church. And the reason for that is because my research, my comments, my academic work was getting notoriety. I was getting noticed by my peers and my instructors, especially from my male instructors, to have my male professors able to say, wow, Sarah, that's a great insight. I hadn't thought of it that way. Let's go ahead and take this resource that Sarah has shared. Let's break it down a little bit more. What can we learn from this? It wasn't until I experienced a male in an authoritative position giving my voice credit and hearing it and utilizing my voice for further learning for the entire class, that I truly recognized just how long my voice had been silenced within my church community. Welcome back to Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma. I'm your host, Sarah Westbrook, joined by my very handsome husband, Mason Westbrook. We're excited to be here today.
I'm here. I think that was a terrific opening. I think that people don't often realize what's missing until they kind of get slapped with it.
Right.
And I think that that was a very, very good opening. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mason. So our goal for today, we're going to be talking about how the church silences women's voices. And silencing doesn't necessarily mean no noise. Silencing means discrediting. It means stomping down on. It means not valuing as much. It means adding caveats and qualifiers to the voice. That also counts as silencing or marginalizing or othering somebody's voice. And so we're going to talk about that today. And our goal is to demonstrate that it happens in the Mormon church. It's a common thing to occur in high demand religions. And we really want to talk about how the church gets away with it. Because if you talk to most active LDS women, they are going to tell you, my voice isn't silenced. I have a role. I am valued. And so I want to talk about, how does the church get away with this? And what we can do on the outside as we're recognizing it. How do we help encourage equality for these women when they don't realize they are being marginalized? Because Mason, what you said, oftentimes we don't know what we're missing until we get a taste of it. And then we're like, whoa, I don't like this.
Well, and I would add to that too, that we're looking for real equality. I've heard lots and lots of church members and presidents and apostles talk about how the sexes are equal in the church. But for the most part, I feel like it's mostly talk. How do we find real equality? And what do we do as members? Because certainly I don't have much authority in the church, neither do you.
Right, you not anymore.
Right.
You don't have much authority anymore. You did
and
for a while.
Even when I did try to affect this a little bit as a bishop, but even then I wasn't as aware of it as I could have been. And some of these, they don't get fixed on a ward level. They're an organizational thing.
And I'm going to say, from my experience of you being the bishop and my experience of you being my husband, the only time I've ever felt silenced by you was during that first year after I told you I was leaving the church. But prior to that, I felt like you were one of those bishops that did a really good job of listening to the female voice, valuing it. If they brought their ideas to you, you went the extra mile to enact those ideas. I feel like you definitely relied on your Relief Society president and trusted the female leaders in your ward to give valuable input in ward council. And I can say, I've been in leadership as an auxiliary president, I want to say in 4 bishoprics. Yeah, 4 bishoprics, 2 in North Carolina, and 2 in Texas. Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So in 4 bishoprics, I've been an active role, and my experience of having my voice heard or silenced has very much depended on the individual leadership in those words, and not always the bishop. Like, I remember an elders quorum president telling me I needed to keep my mouth shut. That did not go over very well because the bishop redirected that elders quorum president quite harshly. And so there are units in the church where women's voices are more valued than other units in the church. And I would say that Mormonism, on the whole, is not necessarily the worst at silencing women's voices, not by a long shot. There are definitely organizations that do it much worse. There's other organizations that do it much better. Yeah. Again, we're going to dissect this within the Mormonism wheelhouse because that's where our experiential expertise lies.
Right. Well, and I'd like to say, too, that because I think what happens too often is that someone will say, well, that's not my experience, and they stop there. We want to be able to look at this empathetically and understand that that is the experience of many, many women. I don't even think it's the experience of most women in the church, but it's absolutely the experience of a lot of women in the church, and it is organizationally supported. And so if we can empathetically take a look at what we're going to talk about today and go, yeah, okay, I get that. Maybe that's not my experience and I'm grateful for that, but I can see how it is somebody's experience and how we can work to fix that.
Absolutely. I love that you're emphasizing the need for viewing it from somebody else's perspective and experiences in order to heal and fix and better the overall organization.
Yes.
The healing comes through.
That's what we're going for.
Yes, healing comes through empathetic understanding.
Well, and I'm tired of people. I get this in my family a lot. People say, "Well, that's not how it happens," or because it's not their experience, or because they haven't even looked. They completely write off the viability of somebody else's opinion, and we're really missing the opportunity to help fix something, or at the very least see it in a different way.
Absolutely. It reminds me of that time your brother was visiting, and we were talking about how when Abigail joined our family, suddenly I was getting stopped at Walmart for my receipt to be checked more often. And your brother said, no, it doesn't happen that way. And my question for him was, well, how many times have you left Walmart with a black kid in your shopping cart?
Right.
0. You cannot minimize my experience. You know, when I would go shopping at Walmart with my oldest son, Eric, who is very visibly Hispanic. He's, dark complected. He's got very beautiful caramel brown skin. Or with Abigail, we got stopped more often for a receipt check than I ever do when I'm accompanied by my white children. Now, that's my experience. Your brother wouldn't have experienced the same thing because he doesn't have black kids.
Right. So what we want is for you to be able to feel some empathy and put yourself in somebody else's shoes and go, not that doesn't happen. Oh my gosh, what would that feel like?
I like that, Mason.
What would that feel like? Because that is really what this is. And if we can do that, because frankly, I'm a white male, right? Like the experiences of women getting marginalized, I have very little experience with that aside from my wife, my mother, my daughter, the few women that I associate with in the church. Because when I had the ability to affect it, I like to think I affected it in a positive way, but it's not my experience. Right. And so I have to be able to empathetically go, what would it be like?
Well, and when you and I were doing the prep for this episode a couple days ago, as we were kind of formulating the ideas and whatnot, you said, I just don't think it's as bad as they say that. And I turned at you and I was like, that's because you're not a woman. And that was like, you took that step back and went, yep, you're right. And then I think listening to the Mormon Stories episode, which one? Because I asked you to listen to that. I said, hey, Mason, I think that this would be a really good
episode. That's episode
for
1692 with John Larsen.
Okay, so 1692 with John Larsen.
And then the Mormonism Live one is episode 107. Both of those are in our show notes. Both of them address this issue very well, although the Mormonism Live one doesn't really talk about silencing a woman's voice, it talks specifically about a particular talk where at least one of the stories from that talk really kind of delves into this.
Right. So our history for this episode is that we listened to the most recent Mormonism Live, episode 107, Sherri Dew, a not-so-Christmas special. And we're going to share that story a little bit later in the episode that kind of inspired us to do this. But then my favorite Mormon Stories episodes are the ones with John Larsen. And so when I went into Mormon Stories, I was like, you know what? I haven't heard a Mormon Stories episode in a while, and I've got some time. Y'all, I had the flu, so I needed something to listen to while I laid dying in my bed. I'm telling you, when I was younger... Squirrel here. When I was younger, I could push through any illness and rock as a mama. And now when I get sick, I'm the epitome of the stereotype man cold. It's pathetic. So anyway, I was listening to this because I wasn't feeling well. And so when I went in, the November episode with John Larsen is gender discrimination in the Mormon church. And as I listened to that, Mason, I sent that to you because of your comment of, I don't think it's, because I was telling you some of my experiences, and you were like, no, I'm not sure it's as bad as that, when I said, that's because you're not a woman. And then a few days later, I get, this episode 1692 for Mormon Stories, and I sent it to her. I was like, you need to listen to this in order to increase that awareness. And I think now today, as we're coming to this, you and I are mostly on the same page.
Yeah, and I want to point out, too, that I'm actively trying to see things differently and still can miss the importance of issues. Right. And so if you're not in a place where you're actively trying to see things differently, you're probably missing all kinds of things. And so what we really want is to bring awareness to an issue and talk about what we can do to influence things in a positive way.
So what I hear you saying, Mason, is that because you still occasionally miss things, that's the reason you have not yet been translated, because in all other areas, you're perfect.
Sure, that's totally what I said. Yeah, absolutely.
Just teasing. I'm hitting on you right now.
I'm more likely to get hit with lightning right now than get translated. So,
alrighty. So we're going to go through some resources really, really quickly here, because we kind of want to set up that this is not blah, 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 blah. Oh my goodness, I cannot find my words today. All right, we want to set this up as women's voices being silenced was interwoven into the fabric of the organization and creation of Mormonism, that we can see this very early in our history, and that overall it really has not changed in deeply significant ways. Now, having said that, there have been some changes that we'll talk about that are improvements, but that the overarching theme of women's roles, women's value, women's voices within the church really has not changed in the, how old is the church now? We're still pretty young as a church.
150 years.
So in the last 150 years, the changes...
No, almost 200 years. I'm sorry. My math isn't very good, apparently.
I can no longer trust you.
193 years this year.
Okay. So we're still pretty young as a church, but in almost 200 years, we have not seen significant, meaningful changes that actually honor the female voice within Mormonism.
And we're going to talk about why that is the case. Yeah.
Yeah. Our opinion of why that's the case. All right, here we go. So when we start with Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, we see one of the best examples of silencing the woman's voice is his revelation to Emma Smith about polygamy, which is, I'll just paraphrase it here. Mason, what section is that? Do you remember?
132.
So section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is, Emma, you need to let your husband marry other women. All of the rules of you've got to get the wife's permission. The girl has to be a virgin, blah, 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 blah. But if your wife doesn't let you, do it anyway. So basically this is, Emma, F you, I'm going to marry other women, and you better just give me permission. Otherwise, the Lord is going to strike you down.
Yeah, to paraphrase.
Right. And I think that that's a phenomenal example of her voice is not allowed to be heard. Because anytime a man comes in and says, according to God, you're wrong, and if you don't agree with me, God's going to, strike you from the earth and you're going to go to hell. That's an abusive tactic, and it silences women.
Yeah, well, and this is kind of a squirrel, but I think it applies to what we're going to be talking about today. You see that same sort of process in lots of different aspects of the church, in the fact that, we're all encouraged to pray to know that the church is true, the Book of Mormon is true, the prophet is a real prophet, whatever. But anytime you don't get an answer that falls in line with those things being true, you're the problem. And that kind of, I see that here too. It's like, Emma, you're special. You're awesome. You need to allow.
You are so favored in the Lord's eyes.
Right. You need to allow Joseph Smith to do this. This is a doctrine from God. And if you don't, it's over for you, sweetheart. Right.
Right.
All
you're my
your
favorite,
specialness is
but
gone.
I'm going to toss you because you're not obeying this one thing.
Right.
Right.
So.
Well, and I'm going to agree with that. I would say that one of the reasons the Mormon church still gets away with it and is able to marginalize women is because women believe that this is God's will.
Right.
And why are we going to question God? We've been taught from the time we were little in the Mormon church that questioning God is, you're supposed to, but it's bad. Like I can't, it's such a contradiction. Right. Ask God all of these questions, but if you don't get the answer that God's already said, then stop questioning and just do it. That's not questioning. If it's go ask your dad, even though you already know the answer is my way or the highway, that is not an open dialogue. That is one-way communication. That is not a two-way communication pattern. That would be toxic if it was, well, go ask your dad, even though I already know your dad is going to say no. Because dad always says no, and apparently there's no other option. Like, that's not a conversation. So, example number 2, we watched, it came across our thing on, is it Analyzing? Mason, what was the name of that TikTok? Analyzing.Mormonism?
Analyzing.Mormonism on TikTok, yeah.
On TikTok, yes. And so she did a recent TikTok about Brigham, and that one's going to be linked in the show notes as well. Brigham Young got rid of the Relief Society, and then it did not get reenacted for over 20 years. So, Mason, why don't you give us that? Because I know you have all that.
I do. I wrote out the quote because she does it on a video, so I took the time to just wrote out what she said. This is recorded Sunday, March 9th, 1845. It says, President Brigham Young spoke. Relief Society going to meet again. I say I will curse every man that lets his wife or daughters meet again until I tell them. What are relief societies for? To relieve us of our best men. They relieved us of Joseph and Hiram. I don't want the advice or counsel of any woman. They will lead us down to hell. When I want sisters and the wives of the members of this church to get a relief society, I will summon them to my aid, but until that time, let them stay at home. And if you see females huddling together, veto the concern. And if they say Joseph started it, tell them it is a damned lie, for I know he never encouraged it.
Gaslighting, and then blaming the women for Joseph and Hiram's death.
Well, and I think it just really speaks to his opinion of what the sisters have to offer.
Right.
That is definitely not in line with what we're being told right now, but it's not necessarily out of line with what the sisters are able to do in the church.
Right. Well, and then the other piece is, like, I think it was Heber C. Kimball that said, I can get another wife as easy as I can get another cow. And that, again, and I don't have the reference point for that. Well, I'd have to find that one. We probably need to find that one to put it in here. But that just tells you, how the founding men of the church felt about women. Now, I think it's fair to put in here that their opinions were not that far off from societal opinions. They may have been a lot more open and degrading in speaking it because they were the untouchable prophets of God. They were in that position of power. But still, I I have a hard time supporting these individuals as prophets, seers, and revelators when they are so hateful and harmful to the mothers of their children, their wives. A lot of people will tell me things. I've heard this, but it was the church that allowed women to go to college first. Well, yeah. And all of the degree plans that women were supposed to do were to help men. And in fact, if you look at what is the woman's role within the church, we are auxiliary people, meaning we are not necessary, but that our job is to make the man's job easier. That every calling a woman holds in the church has a male supervisor. No woman in any position in the Mormon church is able to make an executive decision without having it approved by a male. And that's the difference between men, quote unquote, hold the priesthood versus women who cannot, despite all of the gibberish that they talk about in trying to get women to say that they do hold the priesthood.
Right. The quote actually here, it's not saying who it's from. It's on Reddit. It's coming from a book that is written about Mormonism. It says, I think no more of taking another wife than I do of buying a cow, which I think is actually a little worse than what you just said.
Yay! Way to go, Mormon founders. You suck. Okay. Moving right along. Sorry, that was my immature amygdala getting a dig in. Squirrel.
Is that what that was?
That is what that was.
Okay.
Yes, I'm human too. Okay. And then the other piece here is the idea that for so long, and I think the church is trying to move away from this a little bit, but that it's the woman's responsibility to manage a man's thoughts. Like my dress directly influences a man's worthiness and righteousness, and that women get blamed for the man's mistakes. And that's very, very icky for me. I remember when my dad said something to me about your daughter shouldn't dress like that. She could get raped for wearing that. And I remember looking at him and saying, I don't care if my daughter is walking down the highway butt ass naked. If a man rapes her, he has committed the crime, and that's on him, not on her. I don't think that there are any research studies or statistics out there that say if a woman wears short shorts, she's more likely to be raped, or a woman who wears a tank top is more likely to be raped than, say, a woman who is fully covered. I would actually say that women are more likely to be sexually assaulted in high demand, close-knit religious communities where their voices are silenced than those in the world based on the clothing attire that they wear. Now, I do want to clarify, I have no statistical data to support that idea other than anecdotal things that come out of the Amish communities, the Mormon communities, Catholic communities, where we have this high prevalence of sexual assault towards minors. And so I think sexual assault happens more because the environment that a person is in than the clothing that they have on their body. That's my opinion. So I've got a couple of stories here before we really start to dig in and break down a talk for me. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about, it came up in the Mormon Stories episode with John Larsen that we've already cited. And that is one of the things they brought up is that women in the Mormon church are not trusted with money. And I never really clearly thought about it that way before, but it brought up a memory of when I was serving as the primary president, and then later when I was serving as the young women's president. So we're talking about two different wards, two different leaderships. In one of them, it was shortly, let's see, one of them, Mason, was also in the bishopric. So that would have been North Carolina. Mason, you were in the bishopric. I was the primary president at that time. And I organized a fundraiser for the Boy Scouts. We did an auction. It was highly successful in the unit. But the rule was I was not allowed to collect any of the funds from that auction. Instead, it was all done on the honor code. So I was not trusted, but the members were trusted to actually pay what they had auctioned. And what it was that once you finished your auction, you had to write down whatever it was that you did on a tithing slip. And then that tithing slip had to go directly to a member of the bishopric. They could not hand it to me and then trust me to hand it to the bishop. I was expressly instructed not to touch the tithing envelopes. And I want to say a handful of people came up to me at the end to hand me those tithing slips. And I said, no, it has to go to my husband. I'm not allowed to touch it. And they were like, well, I don't know where your husband is. Can you just give it to him? And the answer was no. I could not hand a closed, sealed envelope to my husband because I was not a member of the male-only bishopric. I was trusted as an auxiliary president. I was the primary president. I had been serving in that calling for several years. There was nothing of my behavior that would have indicated that I was not trustworthy to hand over those funds. And yet that was the rule. I do remember the next year because there was some confusion in how to get the funds to the bishop. And so we actually made a little box that you could put your tithing slips in that a member of the bishopric would come at the end of cleanup and pick up the box. So a shoebox on the stage was more trustworthy to stick the money in than in the organizer's hands. And I find that very interesting because if you're worried about those funds disappearing, it's a lot easier for a youth to pull a couple of envelopes or take a shoebox
walk away with a box,
and walk away with the box without people noticing than it is if you hand it directly to an adult organizer who is, for the event, handing it off to the bishop. And so that was really difficult for me. When I remember when it happened, I was irritated. And then when John Larsen brought it up in that episode, it was like the first time that I was like, yes, that bothers me.
Yeah.
That bothers me a lot. Like, why are we so protective of those donations?
Right. Ironically, the people that actually handle the donations don't have to hold the priesthood at all. So, yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, like the finance secretary, the ones that actually open the tithing envelopes and input things and then set them up for deposit. They don't have to be a priesthood holder. They don't have to be male. They could be anybody according to the rules.
So the ward clerk does not have to hold the priesthood?
The ward clerk does. I'm saying the finance clerk.
Oh, the finance clerk for the ward does not have to hold the priesthood.
So maybe according to the actual ward leadership they do, but there's nothing about their role that requires priesthood at all. So it could be easily held by somebody else or by someone who, isn't active even in their priesthood or whatever is what I'm trying to say.
Lovely.
That makes sense.
But he does have to be male. Finance clerk has to be male.
Yes, and then he can't collect tithing. He does.
Right, he opens the envelopes, puts the data in the computer, and deposits
with a bishopric member.
checks.
Right, he's not alone to do it. But then also, yeah. So anyway,
lovely.
But yeah, I understand the frustration there. It makes sense, and that's one of those things. According to the current organization, I don't know what the fix would be, but it's telling that it is that way.
Absolutely. My final story for me before we really start to dig in, and then Mason's going to share what really stood out to him, is one of my last attendances in a Mormon church. We were sitting in Sunday school. The lesson was being given by somebody who I actually have a lot of respect for, male teacher. And I raised my hand and shared a thought. It was on how to teach effectively within the church. And I raised my hand and I shared a thought, and they passed over it. They just went, "Oh, thanks, Sister Westbrook," and then moved on to something else. And I felt a little irritated because they changed the subject. They didn't give my comment. And I'm sitting here going, okay, I'm an educator. I'm a behavioral health specialist. Like, I have the credentials. I know that my comment has value and meaning. And so I raised my hand at a second point and shared something else along the same thought line. And once again, it got passed over as not really very valid. It was, just again, that thank you for your comment, Sister Westbrook. And they moved on and changed the subject. So I was like, well, I wonder what would happen if I said that I learned this at the hands of Elder Bednar, which was true. When I was in North Carolina, I took this, training class that Bednar had prepared. I'd met him in person when he was there for some missionary, something like went by and shook his hand type thing. Did not have any kind of a conversation with him in North Carolina, but it was through the Learning to Become series. Mason, do you remember what that was called? Act in Knowledge, Learning to Become.
I don't remember what the series was called, but yeah.
Something. So we had this series, and it was at the beginning of the launch for the missionaries and the seminary programs to the, I believe what's now the Come Follow Me.
Increase in Learning was the
Increase in Learning. Yes, that's what it was. So the Increase in Learning. And so I had taken those lectures and followed that. And I was part of the startup of the training programs of how to teach, Teaching in the Savior's Way. That's what it was called. The Teaching in the Savior's Way stuff, which is where they were getting away from reading the scripts right out of the manual.
And before they had actually changed the Sunday school program.
Right, before it was
Teaching
launched.
the Savior's Way, yep.
Right, before it was launched in North Carolina, they were, I don't know if they were beta testing it.
They were.
Or whatnot, but that was for the missionaries and for the seminary teachers is where it started.
Right.
And so I raised my hand a third time in the Sunday school class, and I said, when I was sitting in a conference with Elder Bednar, Bednar said, and then I inputted grammar. I input my previous comment, but stated that it had come directly from Bednar. And they took the next 20 minutes and discussed the value of my insight, thinking that it was Bednar that had said it. And I just sat back and went, if that doesn't demonstrate that my opinion is meaningless when it comes from Sarah, but my opinion stated as Bednar is suddenly this huge, valuable thing. If this is not an example of that, I don't know what else is. And like I said, that was one of my last Sundays there because I would sit in Sunday school. It was not because I was offended. For me, I had gotten to a point, at that point in my life, it was just that, well, that's fascinating. And, moved on because that's just where I was in my life, emotionally speaking. But every time I would sit in Sunday school, something would be said or taught, and I would just, my blood would start to boil, and I would fume, and I would get angry, and I was like, yeah, I got to exit this before I destroy somebody else's peace and coming, and that was not my intent. So that was one of the last Sundays that I went. So that would have happened to me, I don't know, 3-ish years ago, 2-ish, 3-ish years ago, whenever it was.
Sometime in the last couple of years, yeah.
Yeah. All righty. So, Mason, did you have any?
I would just like to add to that. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was because you were a woman or because you weren't just a member or because it was Elder Bednar. Who knows for sure? But if you don't recognize that sort of thing happens, that pattern is a very real pattern, then again, you're missing the point of what's going on. It's not about that particular story as much as it is about how that story demonstrates the problem that is fairly rampant throughout the church organization.
It's a piece of data that demonstrates a much larger problem.
Right.
And again, I have to this day still deep respect for the gentleman that was teaching that class. I actually work with that gentleman in the professional field. And I won't say what that gentleman does because it would be too easy to identify him. But I have a deep respect for this man and his profession and what he does for our community and whatnot. And I feel that respect, the professional respect, is very equal. But in the church, that equality is gone. Because in our professional work, my voice is valued. It is taken into consideration. It is utilized to make decisions for people's lives. But in the church, I had to caveat it as it came from Bednar to be heard by somebody who outside of the church values my professional role, my professionalism, my work in my field, and my contribution to society in my field. Like, I am highly respected in this individual's eyes as a professional. And our entire relationship dynamic shifts the moment I walk into the church and I'm Sister Westbrook instead of Sarah Westbrook, MS, LPC, NCC, getting ready to start her doctorate degree. What did you want to tell the story from the Mormonism Live thing that stood out for you?
If that's what you're ready for, sure.
Yeah, let's do that one.
This is your carriage. I'm just a passenger.
You're a passenger today?
I usually am. But again, this is you talking about women and how they are marginalized in the church. So if you're ready for that, then sure.
Yeah, Mason, I think that we've gotten to a good place. So in our prep meeting, I think you were walking in and out because I wasn't feeling well, so I was taking a bath and listening to Mormonism Live, probably TMI here, and you were walking in and out of our bathroom.
She listens to Mormonism Live while she's taking a bath.
I listen to Mormonism Live naked.
Try that one on Bill and RFM.
That's TMI. Oh my gosh. Okay, that's okay.
You said it.
And it is true. Okay.
So anyway, you were listening to it.
And
I decided to listen to it because there was a couple of things that you heard that I thought were poignant. And so there's a lot of stuff that Bill and RFM go into in this talk. It's a very good episode, but not a lot of it specifically relatable to how women's voices get silenced. But towards the end, there's a story that she tells. She was
Sherri Dew.
And we'll have the
talk.
It's in Mormonism Live.
Well, and wait,
but we'll have the
on,
talk reference as well.
The talk of that one is Sherri Dew, a not so Christmas special, and it was her Christmas devotional given at BYU Hawaii on November 1st of 2020. Prophets Can See Around Corners is where the story that Mason is about to share comes from. Right,
prophets can see around corners. So she's talking about being in this meeting with an apostle. She does not say who it was. She's in this meeting with this apostle, and they're talking. I forget what their content was, but she's with this meeting that went for several hours. Well, early on in the process, somebody had called somebody's sister something or brother something.
Right, brother
or whatever.
And sister.
And this apostle stopped them and said, from now on in this meeting, we're going to refer to everybody as either mother or father. And frequently corrected them throughout the meeting. Well, Sherri Dew, famous really for not being married,
she's famous
no children,
in Mormonism,
because it's rare for a Mormon woman to reach leadership positions without having been married, without having children, and fulfilling the measure of their creation. So she started to get upset. She was visibly hurt by this, according to her. Offended, hot, and I don't remember all the exact words she used, but this is essentially what she was saying. And at the end of the meeting, she left quickly. Like, she didn't want to talk to anybody. She didn't want to appear upset, I guess. She left and went to her car, and I think she says that she sat and she cried in her car for a while.
Which is so heart-wrenching because Sherri Dew has accomplished a great deal within Mormonism. She's a very successful person within Mormonism. Her career is, I don't know if she still is or was, but I think she still is the CEO of Deseret Book Publishing Company.
I think so.
Like, she's authored books. I mean, she's a very professional woman.
She's authored a couple of autobiographies of prophets.
Right.
Yeah.
She's done a lot, and yet her value within Mormonism is less than because she's not a wife and mother.
Yeah, well, and what really stuck out to me in this situation, which I've seen too many times, is that for whatever reason, and I don't know if she's correct in her assumption, but for whatever reason, she felt she could not speak up.
Right.
She couldn't say, "Oh, wait a minute. That's kind of offensive to some of us who don't sit in that situation. Can you help me understand why this is so important
She
to you?
couldn't
Can we have a
question.
discussion about this?" Mm-hmm. She felt she couldn't do that.
Right. Of all the people who couldn't speak up, I don't think Sherri Dew is one of those that has a hard time having her voice heard.
Right.
But in this position, she didn't feel her voice could be heard. For me, that really relates to, in my professional field with this gentleman, my voice is valued. But as soon as I walk into the doors of the chapel, it's gone.
As soon as I'm Sister Dew. And I don't know. I didn't get that impression, but as you say it certainly is a possibility.
Because I believe at that time she was serving.
She was.
In the General Relief Society
presidency.
Yeah. So, I mean, she's not. When you think about a ward council, supposedly the women are supposed to be able to speak up. And again, if she's in the General Relief Society presidency, that means she's already got an incredibly successful career with Deseret Book Publishing Company. I believe at that point she would have already been a published author. So again, it just doesn't seem, and I don't know Sherri Dew personally, not at all.
Neither do
but
I.
it seems very odd to me as I'm observing and hearing this story. It seems very odd to me that somebody who does not have a hard time speaking up and showing up in public settings would feel like she could not challenge something like that.
Right.
Where she could not pause an apostle and say, for those of us who don't have children, is there a reason? Can you help me understand the reason for saying it this way? And right. I mean, speaking from our personal experience, not being able to have children, like going through infertility treatment and struggling with infertility can be absolutely devastating. Yeah. It is hard. It is mentally difficult to go through. The treatment for infertility is excruciating. Within Mormonism, when you're raised from the time that you're little, that you're supposed to get a husband, you're supposed to get married. If that doesn't work out for you, it's what's wrong with me. We're turning the blame inward, which makes sense because we have this history of men in high positions blaming the women for men's problems.
Right. It's also as it says in the temple, to fulfill the measure of your creation.
Right.
The measure of your creation as a woman is to be a mother and have children and
Mormonism.
Support your husband.
Right. In Mormonism.
And even somewhat in Christianity, but very much so
very much so in Mormonism. So again, it's just, that's very fascinating. And that again reminds me, Mason, of our story when we met that general authority. Yeah. And then you and I are getting chastised for not having a baby yet when we're 18 months to 2 years into our marriage. And neck deep in infertility treatment, being told by somebody who's supposed to talk to and for God that we were sinning because we didn't have a baby yet. Like it's just awful. But yes, I find it very, very, very interesting.
It's telling, and there's
it's very telling.
A couple more things I want to bring up about that.
Could not speak up in that meeting. Go ahead, Mace.
Yeah, she's in essentially the highest women's presidency in the church and did not feel, for whatever reason, that she could criticize or even just ask. Like, maybe it would have been taken as criticism, but it could very well have just been taken as a question.
Right.
Why is this so important to you? Because it's kind of offensive to me.
Well, and she didn't necessarily need to stop his talk to say that. She could have jumped up at a break, pulled him aside and said, hey, what do you think about this? Like, it could have been a private conversation of, I'm feeling a little, confused. Can you help me understand? The next time you get up, can you add some insight for those of us in this room? She, I believe, said in that talk that as she looked around, she recognized she was probably the only one in that room that was not married and did not have children. And so, and mostly did not have children, because if they're calling them mothers and fathers, we're talking about your parentage. So she's looking around going, I'm probably the only one here.
Right.
But she didn't even feel, according to her and the story that she told, to pull them aside and say, hey, what about those of us who can't have kids? Can you help me understand, what's the purpose? Whatever. She couldn't do it quietly and then have it addressed later either. She, according to her, did not feel safe speaking up and asking a question or challenging it.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things I want to add to this too. For one, it demonstrates that, in this case, an apostle, but I think it filters down to leadership in the church on every level, and I'll explain that here in just a second. But an apostle can say whatever he wants to say in a situation like that without regard for the people around him.
Because we are not allowed to criticize.
Because we're not allowed to criticize.
The leadership.
Right. Elder Oaks said, don't criticize your leadership. Even if you're right, don't do it.
Right. It's wrong to criticize leadership, even if the criticism is true.
Right. So that's the big issue.
And then the other piece of, we don't apologize. So when we get it wrong, we also don't apologize for it.
Right. You just have to suck it up.
And I want to make sure we make it clear that trickles down to the local leadership. It's considered wrong to criticize the bishop or the stake president. And that if you go above the bishop's head, the standard is to kick it back down to the bishop. So if I go to my stake president and say, I'm concerned about my bishop doing this, can you and I address this? It's almost like this hands off, kick the can back to the bishop. And now the person that I'm struggling with, suddenly that individual
somehow
and I get to work it.
Resolve it.
We have to resolve it. And really what that does is it silences voices. If I'm being abused, the person I'm not going to talk to about that is the abuser.
Right.
I'm going to get somebody else's help. And I'm not saying that all bishops are abusive.
I'm sure
a lot
most
of times they just make normal human mistakes.
They're
but
untrained.
If I'm not comfortable going to my bishop, I need to have somebody else to go to. And if I go to my Relief Society president, she's supposed to go report it to the bishop.
Right.
It's not a safe system.
Right. Well, so now you're talking about leaders on the local level. They're untrained, who are immediately put into an incredible position of power. They hold the keys. They hold the authority in the ward. Everything in the ward goes through them. Everything. And it can be a very dangerous situation in those kind of situations. Now, when I was a bishop, I like to think that I provided a safe space for people to share even when they disagreed with me. I think that I did that. But even as I say that, I don't think I ever went to my sisters and to the leaders and said, hey, do you feel comfortable disagreeing with me in these meetings?
Right.
I never did that because I just assumed that I'd set up the right area. But what if one of those sisters had a bad experience with a previous bishop and now they feel like, I'm not even taking the risk. I'm not doing that. I've lost, and the ward has lost, a very important part of their leadership because now they're not able, they don't feel comfortable questioning their leader when, frankly, I need them to question me.
Well, and what you're talking about is a phenomenon that we see in individuals that are coming for counseling or, second marriage individuals. So you're in a second marriage and they come to me for counseling.
All kinds of
One
trauma.
of the things that I have to teach these clients is that, unfortunately, spouses, you are going to be paying the consequences of mistakes made by the first spouse because there's a trauma response here. And so a lot of times as you're working through these difficult situations, don't take your spouse's trauma response personally. This is normal. This is what the brain does to try and protect you from being harmed again. And so, Mason, there's no way for you to have any idea of previous traumatic experiences or abuse patterns or, was this sister or brother raised in a home where they could question authority or, what's going on here? And I think, there's a couple of people, as I think about the ward when you were bishop, There's one sister in the ward that got furious with you, and to this day, you still have no idea what you did or said to get her upset. The sister that had the special needs daughter. Mm-hmm. You have no idea what you did wrong, but her anger and shutting you out was so abrupt and aggressive that you were not even given the opportunity to go in and say, where did I mess this up? And so, we have to be able to create environments in systems where lots of different people have lots of other different people trained to respond to difficult conversations and then come down to heal that. When we look at people who investigate sexual assault or sex crimes, we have male and female investigators because sometimes the victim won't talk to a male just because. We see that in my field all the time. Like one of the questions that a lot of behavioral health hospitals will ask is, do you prefer a male or female provider? I'm going to be honest. Male providers in my field often struggle to get clientele because women are generally the gender that are most likely to seek out counseling, and women generally prefer a female provider in my field. Now, that's not to say men cannot be successful in this field. I personally prefer a male provider. So, I tend to prefer talking to a man when it comes to behavioral health. And so I have sought out male providers. Am I sexist? No, there's just enough stuff in my brain.
You're looking for what will benefit you the most.
Right.
That's fair.
So
there's one other piece to this that I really wanted to bring out, if I may, and that is that she then, after this meeting, she talks about how she spent essentially the next 6 months, according to her, she spent the next 6 months just dealing with this, struggling with it, and then preparing to speak in general conference. And then she speaks in general conference, and the talk that she gave is, "Are we not all mothers?" Now, I don't want to take away from her the peace that she found
that was
from
her
this situation.
Resolution.
Good for her.
Personal
Good for her.
Journey.
The problem that I have is that in this journey, she states she never went to that person. Mm-hmm. She never was able to talk about it with him.
With the apostle that said
With that apostle. And probably struggled to talk about it with anybody because now you're, quote unquote, criticizing the church leadership, which is specifically prohibited, right? We don't do that. So she was put in this difficult situation with no real means to address it.
Right.
And when she then goes to general conference and gives this great talk, according to her, I remember listening to it and thinking, well, that was cool. I don't remember any other details. And I did not see it from the lens that I would see it from now. This was back in, I think, 2001. She gave a talk that completely fell in line with a patriarchal church. Mm-hmm. She stated that this is our role. And she fell right in line with the patriarchy, and that was what was expected of her.
She gaslit herself into compliance.
Right. And I know that happens. Mm-hmm. I've seen it happen. You've seen it happen. It happens all the time. And we're not done with Sherri Dew and gaslighting, right? Yeah. We have another one to address.
This episode, and with all due respect to Sherri Dew, again, she's a very outspoken woman. But yes, the next one that we are going to delve into and really break apart, I think is a really great example of, so in the beginning we were like, why does the church get away with it? And that's what we're going to talk about next is why does the church get away with silencing women's voices, but keeping the women in the church feeling like their voices are valued and heard? And so that's where we're going to be shifting into next here. And Sherri Dew's talk that was given at some conference for women. It was not a general conference for women. I want to say, hey, shout out. Thank you so much to the listeners on the Mormon Stories
I saw that.
podcast
they page
where it came from. And the Mormonism live podcasting pages because I posted on there. I was like, because I've been looking for it for an hour this morning going, I want to dissect this as the example for why the church gets away with silencing women's voices and the women not even noticing that it's happening to them. This is the talking about, and I could not find it because in my brain it was at a general conference thing. And so thank you to the fans of Mormon Stories podcast Facebook page and the Mormonism Live Facebook page. Within 10 minutes, I had the answer and the source material for this. Y'all rock. So thank you so much for that. I love the ex-Mormon community where people are willing to just jump and help you find those sources. I love the fact that I can cross-post my stuff over there and get support and yes, you do you, and here it is, and go for it. Because all of us have a different voice. All of us share things in a different way, and it's all meaningful. And I love that my experience so far in the ex-Mormon community has been that the nuanced way that we all dissect this is valued. We've gotten out of that. There's only one way to think about the ex-Mormon world. And so thank you to my fellow podcasters and for the platforms and for setting those things up. It really, helped me out today. So y'all rock. So why does the church get away with this? Before, Mason, you start going into the points so this is Sherri Dew.
What do Mormon women get?
What do Mormon women get? That was then changed to what do LDS women get after Nelson did his whole the term Mormon is a win for Satan.
Right. Ironically, February 2018 is when this talk was given. January 2018 is when President Nelson became prophet. And then April 2018, I think, is when he said, we're not doing the Mormon thing anymore in General Conference.
So 3 months after she gives the speech, she has to change the title from Mormon to LDS.
Right. Which is incredibly disingenuous to history in general.
Right. Rebranding at its finest, but toxic rebranding for sure, because we're going to just scrub the word Mormon from our history.
Right.
So anyway, before we get into this, I want to set this up as keep in mind that from the time you join the Mormon church, or if you're born into it, from the time you are born, you are raised in an environment that teaches you that this is absolutely God's will, that this is the only true way, and to question that is potentially damaging to your salvation unless your questioning leads you back to what has already been stated as truth. So we're going to kill critical thinking, and that is one of the reasons why the church gets away with it. And so really what we're setting up here is I want you all to be able to hear some of the examples that Sherri Dew gives in this women's conference address as look at what women in the church get. Look how their voices are not silenced. Look at how we're not marginalized. And I want you to be able to identify the subtle gaslighting that comes from the place of, so she leaves very specific things out, and it comes from that place of, this is the way that God does it, and I'm only going to give the reporter enough information to shut down the argument. And also that she never answered the reporter's direct question. She distracted with giving this laundry list of everything Mormon women do. And I remember the first time I listened to this, at the end of that, like it's like an 8-minute or something thing.
Right.
I felt burned out. I was like, you're right. I do all of that stuff, and I still don't feel valued, heard, equal. I'm exhausted over here.
You have to do all of those things to have any kind of value in this organization.
Right. Well, and a lot of that comes from, so another personal experience. Again, I've sat in ward councils in 4 different units prior to leaving the church in different positions of leadership. And my experience in that ward council is that at the end of the ward council, everybody would get their assignments. We would go back the next week or 2 weeks or whatever for the next ward council. And for the most part, the women had gotten everything done. And the men were like, oh, yeah, no, I'm still working on that. That if the young women's or the primary were given a certain task to organize some event, it got done, it was planned, it was prepped, the assignments were made, the assignments were fulfilled, like step by step, everything came off smoothly. If we did the same thing for the men, when it came to the young men and the young women, you're going to play basketball or have a planning meeting. Like that's the backup. The men didn't prepare anything. All right, let's have a planning meeting. You do your planning meeting, no, nothing comes of it. That's actually something that disenchanted our son Eric, who is very much an organized, I'm going to set a goal, I'm going to meet the goal kind of thinker. And when he was in those positions of, the Aaronic priesthood leadership as a youth, they would plan all of these things and then nothing would happen. And he finally threw his hands up and said, this is a total waste of my time, because there's never any follow through on what we say we're going to do. And that my experience was without the women, nothing happened. But the men get all the credit for what the women do. I remember when I was 16 and I had had sex, during my 4 months of quote unquote disfellowshipment for my repentance process of having sex before I was married, I was required to attend the Relief Society with my mother. And I remember a member of the bishopric coming in and talking about how wonderful women were, because if it wasn't for the women, there would not be tablecloths on the tables and centerpieces as flowers on the tables, and the church would look very bland. And that was what women were for. We were there to decorate and make something beautiful, not have significant value. So...
Right. Well, and I don't want to devalue the role of beautifying an area, right? But that is kind of a gaslighting thing in that you're making that the importance of a woman. And that's not equality. That's not equal opportunity in the church. That is the women doing well the role that they've been given. Not the same thing. Not at all. And I'm tired a little bit of... I've listened to lots of people talk, Spencer W. Kimball way back in 1979, talking about how the role of women and men in the church is equal. And we've been spouting this rhetoric for a long, long time, and only now, recently.
I love that you call it rhetoric.
I think that's what it is.
Because?
Because it is an attempt to... in my opinion, it is an attempt to make women feel that the roles they've been given is adequate and equal for them. And I don't think that it is. Now,
so the dictionary definition of the word rhetoric is the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially the use of figures of speech and other compositional techniques. Language designed to have a persuasive or impressive effect on its audience, but often regarded as lacking in sincerity or meaningful content.
Well, I would say...
love that word for this.
I would say that I used the right word.
And
that agree. I used it accurately, and I used it exactly the way that I meant.
Love
is
it.
That there's a lot of effort... Especially recently, there's a lot of effort to placate our sisters. And there's another word that I think I use completely correctly, to placate the sisters in order to make them feel comfortable within the assigned role that they've been given. And we're seeing recently...
So that they're complicit and will shut up.
Yeah. But we spend a lot of time asking our sisters to speak up, to speak out, to share their inspiration, to share their stuff. But the reality is your inspiration as a sister is entirely dependent upon the effect that it will have on the church, is entirely dependent upon a man somewhere.
Yes.
Entirely. Even in your own home, much of your quote unquote inspiration is dependent upon your husband, because if you're living the role correctly, you're working together as a husband and wife, well, that means husband has veto power over your inspiration. No, I don't like that. I don't think that's going to work out well for us. We're not doing that. And you can be good partners and still have that sort of thing going on.
Absolutely.
Your role is subjugated by the priesthood authority that exists in
Did you just burn out?
No, I'm just looking for the word. The priesthood authority exists in totality in the church. The priesthood authority runs everything, even the organizations that the women are a part of. And John Larsen brought this up. They're called auxiliaries. They don't matter to the overall role according to the priesthood authority of the church.
Right.
In essence, they're saying we could, as a church, we'd survive just fine without the Relief Society. We'd survive just fine without the Young Women's or the primary. We'd be just fine.
Right. The auxiliaries are there to keep the women and children busy and out of our hair while we do the important work.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure, too, that we say that one of the reasons I believe that the church has suddenly started all of this very direct rhetoric, because it wasn't something that was spoken about as often when I was a youth.
No.
And I think that that's because of Kate Kelly's movement for equality and the
women in the priesthood. Yeah.
Yeah, the women in the priesthood, but the picketing, the protests? There's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
The protests of women in the priesthood and Kate Kelly's efforts to raise awareness that women are not equal within Mormonism. And so when we go into that, how do we help women who are marginalized recognize that they're marginalized? I think Kate Kelly did that. Now, what Kate Kelly got from a lot of the women, I mean, we're not going to talk about, excommunicated and whatnot from the church. But what Kate Kelly's efforts did was it entrenched some women even deeper, much like what you're going to see with Sherri Dew of, that's not true, look at what I have.
Right.
That's a false narrative. It's going to have that effect. But she also had the effect on many, many people to go, I've never thought of it that way. You're right. That is that experiential change. That is, in my master's program, when my voice was suddenly truly valued by a male figure in authority, a whole new world opened up for me because I had never experienced it in that way before. Now, I don't feel like, again, Mason, I don't feel like you ever silenced my voice. But having my professional opinion, my ideas, my insight, my research valued and acknowledged as my own from a professor.
And as important as someone else's.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. It was that there was equality in that classroom, and it wasn't just my idea. It was like, hey, Sarah came up with this, so-and-so came up with this came up with this.
Right.
How do we connect these ideas to better social change and increase our research efforts, and what are we doing, so on and so forth, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. So, I had one thought in there that you mentioned, they're talking about all the things that we have. Whenever we're asked to focus on everything that we have, it's almost always because we're feeling overwhelmed by something else.
Right. It's a distraction
technique.
It's a
distraction. And I think that is the big thing going on here, is that we're trying to distract us away from the fact, but yes, you don't have the priesthood. Yes, you are marginalized by priesthood leaders. Maybe it's getting better. I'd like to think it is.
In some
but
ways,
we know it's not the same.
Right. We've changed the decoration around it. We've given women, women can witness baptisms now. Whoa.
According to John
amazing.
Larsen, the silent roles you can still play.
Right. Well, and I remember thinking, the witnessing of the baptism, well, we've always been able to witness it. We've just never been official. We've always been in the room. We just didn't get to stand on either side of the font.
Now you get to stand.
Now I get to stand. And my name goes in the program. Yay, me.
Right.
And apparently
it goes on the
women
official
can
form.
do that. Oh, Yeah, and I get my name on a form.
You get a name on the form. The point being...
But I can't frame it.
The point being that all of these things are still marginalizations. The fact that the women's role in the ward is entirely dependent upon what the bishop decides it can be.
Right.
Entirely dependent upon that.
Right. It's the difference of blacks are free. Look at all these things we've given them now. But they can't drink out of the same drinking fountain as whites. And you still have to sit in a different spot on the bus. And it took decades.
Yeah.
And we are still behind the curve for our black counterparts to have the same access to the privileges of a white male than anything else. It's we're changing a little bit, but for the Mormon Church, they didn't give the freedom and equality to women and then start to change. It was, well, we're going to give you this little nugget. Here's this little crumb. Look, it's better. Stop complaining. Look at all these things you can do.
Right. Absolutely.
All right, you ready to jump in?
I was going to say something. I can't remember what it was. Oh, we've talked about this before, that the church, if it's the true church of Jesus Christ, should be ahead on these sort of issues, not behind.
Right. If we are truly God's church.
They're frequently behind.
Oh, and by 2 decades.
And the apostles really applaud us for
being behind.
For being behind. And that's crap. Like, when it comes to social issues, we should be ahead. Way ahead. And we're not.
If God is truly appearing to the prophets and apostles, we should be ahead.
We should be ahead.
The fact that we are behind, for me, Sarah Westbrook, is one of the biggest things that I'm going, this church is not what it states.
It's about people. It is supposed to be about people.
Right.
And if you have policies in place that are deliberately marginalizing people, you're screwing something up.
Right. I cannot worship a God that created me to be a servant to my husband and to men into eternal perpetuity.
Right.
That does not sound happy to me.
Right.
At all.
And the point being, you're getting marginalized.
Right.
So what do we do? Yeah.
All right. So Mason, let's go in. I'm going to go ahead and have you.
So I just wrote down a few notes.
Down.
I just wrote down a few notes of this thing that I wanted to point out. You brought up earlier Increase in Learning, the book by David Bednar that talks about the fact that we focus on doctrine, we focus on principles, we focus on application. I find it interesting that Sherri Dew says that she was getting interviewed by this person, and the very first thing she says is, I didn't even go into the doctrine. I just talked about all these things.
Application.
And it sounds like, she said it almost like a funny thing. It sounds like this was a good choice. BS. Complete BS. Because what that person wanted to know was how we as an organization are fixing the marginalization, and we don't do that by application. We don't do that by giving you more things that you can do in the church.
Right, more tasks.
We do it by giving you the doctrinal roles that matter.
Right. So what we've got is a reporter asking a question about our theology, and the answer she gives is about our culture.
Right. And just crap. The next thing that she pointed out is that the women can pray, they can teach, they give talks. They can pray, they teach, they give talks, they lead organizations. She talks about how there's 400,000 to 500,000 women out there who are in presidencies throughout the world. Okay, cool.
Right. So I'm going to pause you. If you're invited to talk in a sacrament meeting or general conference, who issues that invitation?
A man.
A man who holds the priesthood.
Somebody from the bishopric, but it's always a man, yeah.
Right. If I'm giving a talk and I say something that the man disagrees with, what is your job, Mason? If you were the bishop and I gave a talk and I preach, quote unquote, false doctrine, or I say something wrong, what's your job?
Well, that part is not different for the sexes. Let me point that out. But It is the bishop's job to correct false doctrine. So I would have to stand up as the bishop and either address it with you individually or stand up at the pulpit and say, look, Sister Westbrook, what she said here, that isn't the doctrine of the church.
Absolutely. So the point that I'm bringing is, if I get up, as long as I am saying, preaching, and praying
falling
in line with what the men have said is the prescribed curriculum, I'm good. But if I have an original idea, a question, or I go outside of that prescription, it is a man who corrects me. It is a man who disciplines me. Like, I remember when I went through all of my disciplinary counsel after my affair, and when I was a teenager, it was all men.
John Larsen talks about that specifically too, and it was terrific in that Mormon Stories episode. Well worth the listen for some insight onto that. So what really stuck out to me here is that, so she says there's 400,000 women in leadership.
And in all the callings, they report directly to
men, of course.
Man.
They report to
Sorry, I
priesthood
interrupted
authority.
you. Go ahead, Mace. Throw chocolate
but you're
at me.
right.
Shut me up.
But you're right. But there's two thoughts I had on that. First off, okay, so there's 400,000 women out there. How many men are out there in leadership positions? My guess is 3 times as many, probably, in leadership positions. Not just in callings, but in leadership positions. And the other piece of that is...
Go ahead, and then I'll interrupt.
The other piece of that is she seems to, and this is just my thoughts, this is not what she says, my thoughts, she seems to be saying something along the lines of, because we have more people involved in leadership in general, we must be doing it the best. And that doesn't fall in line. That's not the way it works. Just because you have more women in leadership doesn't mean that we're doing it right or the best or appropriately, whatever word you want to throw in there. It doesn't mean that we're doing it that way.
And they're not really in leadership. We say they're in leadership, but they're not really in leadership. A leadership role means I get to make decisions that down the line that I get to be the end all be all. And that is not the case. In the unit, it's
important.
the bishop.
Not with anything
in the
important.
unit, it's the bishop. In the stake, it's the stake president. Region, it's your regional presidency. General, it's your first presidency. There's always a man. Now, and I'm not saying, okay, let's get rid of these bishops and stuff, but if you had female bishops who had that for the unit, this is the decision in that role of leadership, now we're talking about more equality.
Right. Absolutely.
Right? We should see balance there.
It's not that there shouldn't be some oversight. It's that it's all oversight by men.
Right. Well, and when you look at the leadership again, Mason, and you're talking about these numbers, what do the numbers tell us? If I open up my ensign, which is no longer called the ensign, the Liahona, to that centerfold and general conference, I'm going to have my first presidency, my quorums of the 70. The only women in that picture are the 3 women in the Relief Society General Presidency, the 3 women in the Young Women's General Presidency, and the 3 women in the General Primary Presidency. Yes, they all have their individual boards and whatnot, but when it comes to the quote-unquote leadership positions, we have 9 women compared to hundreds of men.
And even at that level, they have oversight by men.
Right.
They do not make any important decisions for their organizations without approval by a priesthood leader.
Yep.
Yeah.
And priesthood leader means men, because women are not allowed to hold the priesthood or be leaders in a priesthood position. Go ahead, Mason.
The next thing that she says is that she told him that there is nothing held back for women in the temple.
Hey, Mason, what's your new name? You can't tell me, right?
Right. I can't tell you.
Because it's forbidden.
It's forbidden, yeah.
Wait, Mason,
but I know
what's
yours.
my new name? Exactly.
But I know yours.
So, and just, that's probably the simplest one. Women don't stand on the backside of the veil to welcome people into heaven.
You don't do any of the actual ordinances in the temple.
You never have a woman officiating.
And in fact, the only ordinance that you officiate in, which is the initiatory, I did some research on this.
Right.
The reason that I assume that you officiate in that is because up until 1923, you were naked.
Right.
And so were men, right? That wasn't specific to women.
And up until recently, I'm going to say in the last 10 years, you were naked under a shift.
Yeah.
Right. So the only place in the temple that a woman does quote unquote priesthood ordinances
is in the one place it would be completely inappropriate for men to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Is when I'm naked.
Yeah. So I pulled that out. Now this one, I really want to point out why this is a big deal. So she looks at, after saying all these things, she looks at this reporter and says, "Does this sound to you like an organization that doesn't value women?" The problem I have with this statement is it is a leading statement. Mm-hmm. It does not invite a contradictory answer.
Ooh, but Mormons are good at that.
Yeah.
They're very good at rhetorical questions where there's only one right answer.
Right. I'm so bad at that, right? I say that all the time. But that's the idea, is like you're looking for validation of what you've said, not for an actual thought process about what was said.
Ooh, I love that. You're looking for validation rather
Not
than
thought.
Open dialogue and critical thinking.
Right, not thought. Yeah.
Love it. Preach on, Mason. Preach on. I like it when you get on your soapbox. It's hot.
And so I said this already. They keep stating equality, but it's not manifested. You're invited over and over again to get your own inspiration, get your own revelation, but it has to be approved. Let's see. I think that's really the gist of what was there, and I think that unfortunately, whether or not she wants to be, Sherri Dew is placed in a position of authority where really the only way she stays in that position of authority in this organization is to hold up the priesthood. And I think it was in Mormonism Live that they talked about that the only way that a woman stays in authority is to hold up the priesthood.
Right, to do it the way the men say.
Because if
you
don't,
question, you lose your
you're
position.
out. I got hundreds of thousands of women to choose from. I don't need you to rock the boat.
Well, and the other thing too, if you think about it, if Sherri Dew was to rock the boat, she would lose her career. Yeah. She could risk her retirement because she has worked for the church her entire life. She works for Deseret Publishing Company.
Girl.
Right. She is employed by the men who expect her to say these things. She does not have the freedom to criticize without loss of her resources. And if you go back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and if we go back to your brain, if my ability to support myself financially, my access to food is threatened, I'm not working in my frontal cortex. I'm simply not. I am not able to achieve my full potential if my resources, my basic life needs are being threatened. Sherri Dew can't say something different without losing
not without big consequences.
Everything in her life.
And maybe she wouldn't lose everything, right? I don't know, but she would lose a lot.
Which is another reason why the Mormon church gets away with it. Because when I left the church, family out of the woodworks, mostly Masons,
coming to tell you that you're
have
wrong.
been very aggressive in that. And that when I left the church, my initial thing was I'm going to just kind of slink away. I'm just going to go out silently, which isn't true to me. But then anytime they would ask for my opinion, if I hiccuped, they would shut me down. Yeah. And then if I was like, well, no, I think this, it was, I thought you were going to leave silently.
Right.
So in my family, with my father, with your father, with the males in my immediate and Mason's immediate family, Sarah's voice has never been valued. And the women that do well in those family dynamics are the ones who go with the flow of whatever the men are doing.
Right. They're saying things that have already been said.
Right.
For the most part, they get up there and they say their things, and they have good perspectives on things.
But they're preaching to the choir.
But they're essentially saying things that have already been said before. They would be easily to just wipe away. It would be easy to just wipe them away.
Right.
They don't, because they recognize that they absolutely have to have women in their faceplates now. They have to have poster women, just like they've had poster men. So they won't do that, but it's very, very careful. One of the things that John Larsen said that I really, really loved was he said the church knows that it is subjugating women. Mm-hmm. And that means a lot to me. So, yeah, go ahead.
Alrighty, so what do we do? How do you help a woman who is being marginalized inside any system? Any system, what do you do? Step number 1, you hear and value their voice. You listen to understand. You validate their emotional responses. Even when you disagree with them, you honor their voice. That is the absolute best way to help somebody who has never felt like their voice is valued or heard. It is to value their voice. And when there's a disagreement on something, you still validate and restate understanding, and then you respectfully share your opinion without criticism, contempt, or defensiveness. We fall right back into those 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of the Gottman method. If I'm criticizing a person or belittling them because their opinion is different than mine, I am silencing them. A woman in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormonism, does not have, most of them do not have the resources to have a different opinion, because they are told from the time they're little that their role is to get married young, have tons of children young, postpone education and careers for the family. And so too many women do not have the financial resources to do it different. They also do not have, if you're coming from, if you're born and raised in Mormonism, most of those women do not have the social supports to do it differently either. In Mormonism, it is excruciatingly painful to step outside of the prescribed straight and narrow path. And so you have to give, as me on an outsider looking in, I have to be able to honor that environment that they are trying to break free from. Statistically speaking, a woman in a domestically violent relationship has 7 attempts to leave before they are able to leave successfully. Wow. I do not know what the statistic is for the male counterparts. That is the statistic when I went through the Center Against Family Violence in El Paso's training for part of my undergraduate work. And I believe that statistic has remained the same. The last time I looked it up would have been a couple years ago. So it might be a little bit different, but it's not so vastly different that it's a lot. When a person is marginalized, it means they do not have equal opportunity to behave differently. The only way to help them reclaim that, remember in our conversations with a black man, the comparison that, Mason, what was his name?
Emmanuel Acho.
Thank you. The comparison that Emmanuel gave was, you can't suddenly say, blacks, you have all the same privileges, here you go, and not expect them to still be 500 meters behind in the race of life. The only way to actually make it equal is to put them in a golf cart and catch them up or hold somebody else back. The idea applies to all marginalized people. We cannot suddenly say to these women in the church, you have a voice, use it. They don't have the skill set because they've never done it before. They don't have the resources because that's been taken from them. They don't have the opportunity or the social supports because the structure doesn't support them in doing it differently. You on the outside have to respect those limitations and encourage gently, baby steps at a time.
Yeah, you said something that really struck me. You said equal opportunity to behave differently. And I had never really thought of it that way. It's not equal opportunity to act or to behave. It's equal opportunity to behave differently than what you're doing now. Like, women have equal opportunity to behave the way they're supposed to behave, but they don't have equal opportunity in the church to behave the way they want to behave, however that ends up.
Well, and when they test those waters, most often they will get shut down, somewhere along the line. Now, you are going to have those men in the church who hear, value, honor, and give credit where credit is due.
But you have to change every man.
But it still has to go through a man.
Right.
In the church, it still has to go through a man.
And if you want to equalize the voice of a woman, you have to change every man, which means you have to change the organization. You have to change the way that you do things fundamentally, because otherwise, if a bishop says you can speak up, but the husband says, don't you dare, or the husband says you can speak up, but the bishop says, don't you dare, or any number of applications, it's not going to work. It's not going to change. Nothing changes because the organization still exists that suppresses the woman.
Right, absolutely. I would like to close with what's the long-term trauma response here. I can only speak really for mine personally, and that is at the age of 41, I am a successful business owner. I'm successful in my field. I'm well educated. I'm well spoken. I do a very good job with that. And yet, in my vulnerable moments, I seek the approval of a male counterpart. That is something that I still have to challenge on a regular basis. There is still for me, if my husband comes home, Mason, with his thinking face on, I have to check in, are you mad? And in my brain, it's, did I do something to deserve it?
Right.
That is part of my trauma response. We also have to hold space for the fact that change, reclaiming your freedom and that equal opportunity creates uncomfortable feelings because the amygdala is going to say, questioning is wrong, don't do it. So you've got to be able to push through that warning system in your brain and have lots and lots of practice of doing it differently before speaking up and not needing that male approval feels comfortable. This is a dynamic that I see in people who have broken free from that for years on end. That's normal. There's nothing wrong with you. This is your brain's warning bells, the bells that the things that you've been told from the time you were itty bitty before you even knew how to think for yourself. You are challenging those roles. So it's not supposed to feel comfortable. So again, what can you do on the outside looking in? It is be the change. Create the environments so that those who are marginalized are safe with you. Be the safe practice zone. Because when you're able to do that, you create change one person at a time. And the more people that break free from this, you get that snowball effect that gets women's voices going. Something that was brought up in that Mormon Stories podcast with John Larsen was they asked John DeLynn to sit out so that they had more female voices. And what I observed was the conversation is still being led by a white male, John Larsen. And while those other women had very valuable input that was honored and valuable to the podcast, they were not leading the discussion. It's a start. So what can you do? Support women-led organizations. Support women-led podcasts. Do that for women. Let other women see you can be successful. I think one of the best examples for this is Brene Brown, who as a woman has changed the way we understand mental and behavioral health, shame and belonging and acceptance and connection.
Yeah.
As a female.
Yeah.
She has been supported. And I'm sure there are battles there that she's had to fight to be heard as a woman. That is, you live in this world.
Yep.
That is something we're still fighting against.
Yeah.
We can do that in the church, but we've got to, as listeners, as consumers, put our money and our time in places that reach the marginalized voices.
Yeah, I just wanted to add too at the closing that there's one thing that we didn't get into that I really, really liked. I haven't read all of it, but I know what it's about, and it's called Dear Mormon Man. The link will be in our show notes. But the idea being that we have to be able to step in someone else's shoes to really grasp this concept. And so what I'm asking for from you is empathy. Take the time to really, truly understand someone else's experiences, someone else's feelings, someone else's struggles. Because without those things, this doesn't change. This doesn't change. And that's for women and men. There's plenty of women out there who are saying, nah, this isn't really a problem either. But there's a lot of men as well. And just, we need to feel with the others. We need to be able to step in their shoes and understand where they are in order to fix this. Thank you so much for being here.
And believe them.
Yes. Not just, well, I understand, but I also believe what you're saying. Thank you so much for being here. We love being able to talk about the hard things. I hope that they're helpful for you. We're getting feedback that they are, and I really, really appreciate that because that makes a big deal for what we do here. So thank you for being with us. We love you, and we'll see you next time.
Unpacking Mormonism and Other Religious Trauma is hosted by me, Sarah Westbrook, and my husband, Mason Westbrook. Produced by Daisy Girl Communications and Alex Vidalis. Our music today was Moving Forward by Run to Life.